Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving into one of the most iconic aspects in the entire Eldar Index, and of course I'm talking about Dire Avengers. And really why Dire Avengers are so iconic for the Eldar is simply because of that Avenger Shuriken Catapult, right? Basically, the Shuriken Catapult is synonymous with Eldar, and of course Dire Avengers are the masters of it. And they were the absolute terror of 9th edition, especially in the Hail of Doom or Biel-Tan craft world. They were absolutely insane, and you typically saw Hail of Doom lists carrying around up to 3 full units of these aspect warriors. But then, of course, 10th edition arrived, and Dire Avengers were quickly forgotten. They were quickly buried under the pile of OP devastating wound Eldar units that were flooding the meta. And I actually thought that the transition from 9th edition to 10th edition, while, it didn't make Dire Avengers better, it certainly gave them a role other than Hail of Doom, Hail of Doom, Hail of Doom. I know some of you out there loved Hail of Doom. I liked it too, but I wanted something different from Dire Avengers than just being the unit that just deleted everything on the battlefield. Right? And if you guys, just in case you guys started in 10th edition and don't know what I'm talking about, Dire Avengers in a Hail of Doom craft world, on 6s to hit, would auto-wound and do additional AP. I think they were hitting at -4 AP when they hit that stride. I could be a little off on that, but it was completely insane. And they were deleting basically everything in the game when used in big enough numbers. So in 10th edition, I was kind of relieved to see that they finally had a role, but because of all the other units that were, again, flooding the Eldar meta and the Eldar hype, like Wraith Knights and Wraithguard and things like that, no one really gave them a second look. However, they were a very powerful control-based unit that could have some pretty seriously insane overwatch. But I feel like when people finally got around to the idea of using a pack of 10 Dire Avengers with Asurmen in their lists, the January balanced data slate arrived and stole those dreams away from a lot of Eldar players. But to be real with you guys, I don't want to see Dire Avengers go. I really like them as a unit, and I want to see them be effective on the battlefield. So in my latest tier video, I did have them placed in B tier, and I think really, B tier is more of a semi-competitive / casual tier of units. And realistically, I do think this is probably where they're going to stay until the next balanced data slate. However, I have kind of come up with a way to use Dire Avengers that I think can be really effective. And I actually play tested it in a game the other day, and it worked out as intended, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised. But before I do that, let's just go ahead and take a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in today's video. So first, we're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of Dire Avengers, give you guys a quick refresher course on them, their strengths and weaknesses, their combos and synergies, why Dire Avengers took such a big hit in the post-balanced data slate, effective ways to use Dire Avengers after the nerfs, and lastly, the role Dire Avengers play in an Eldar army, and how to make the most out of them. So first, taking a look at the stat line of the Dire Avengers, it's nothing out of the ordinary. You have Eldar movement, average Eldar movement at 7 inches. You have a 4+ save and a 5+ invul, which does mean they're on the more fragile side of aspect warriors. They're not, like Fire Dragons or Dark Reapers who have that 3+ save. But, that's typical. Dire Avengers have pretty much always had that stat line. Now, their weapons are really where the unit shines because they do have a pretty good anti-infantry weapon. It does have 3 shots at strength 4 AP -1 with lethal hits and assault. So that means they could advance and shoot with their weapons. This does help in some situations because, of course, their ranged weapons are only 18 inches. And lethal hits, of course, means they punch harder against tougher targets. Now, the Exarch can be armed with a Shuriken pistol as well, but you're never going to want to do this for reasons I'll go over later. As far as their melee weapons go, it's nothing special. They're basically like all shooting aspect warriors. 2 attacks, strength 3, AP 0, nothing to write home about. The Exarch can be armed with a Dire Sword or Power Glaive, but neither are good, and you should never arm your Dire Avengers with close combat weapons. And simply put, it's just because they're just awful. mean, if you look at them, the Dire Sword only has 3 attacks, strength 4, AP -2, damage 1 with devastating wounds. It's essentially a power weapon with devastating wounds. The Power Glaive, on the other hand, is a bit better in my opinion because it does have that extra pip of strength, but doesn't have damage 2, so it's just not going to punch hard against much of anything. As far as their abilities go, they hit Overwatch on a 5+, or 4+ if you control an objective that you're on. So essentially what this means is that if you control an objective with even one Dire Avenger, the entire unit is going to be overwatching on a 4+, which is a very strong board control ability, and can really deny a lot of area of the board from opponents that want to use infantry to try to take your objectives away. And I've actually found this especially helpful against opponents' units who just want to be thrown into melee to overwhelm them with objective control. So things like cultists, Imperial Guardsmen, things that are just advancing for the sake of getting into range of your unit so that they can, of course, control that objective. As for the war gear they can take, the XR can take a Shimmer Shield, but again, it's only a 4+ invulnerable save, and you're probably not going to want to include it because it does replace one of his weapons. As far as the war gear options, the XR can be armed with 2 Avenger Shuriken Catapults, a Dire Sword, a Power Glaive, or a Shimmer Shield. Basically what it is you can be armed with a Dire Sword pistol, you could be armed with a Shimmer Shield Dire Sword, a Power Glaive pistol, or a Power Glaive Shimmer Shield. However, the only weapon worth it is the additional Shuriken Catapult. Again, you're getting 3 extra shots with the Exarch. That means you're getting 3 extra attacks at strength 4, AP -1 with lethal hits and assault. That is always going to be much, much better, especially with the ability of the unit, than any of the other melee options. As for their point cost, they cost 70 points for 5 and 140 for 10. They are on the cheaper side for Aspect Warriors, but not by a whole lot. And that's where a lot of players kind of lose their interest in this unit, because for 5 more points, you can have a unit of Swooping Hawks who have comparable shooting damage and can score on objectives. And at the end of the day, if you have a unit that can perform both roles at the same time, then you're probably going to want to take that over a unit that just performs one role, especially if they're kind of somewhat equal in the shooting department. Now, that is, of course, before you account for the fact that Dire Avengers can overwatch on a 5+ or 4+ on an objective. However, this is an objective-based game, and Dire Avengers typically, even though they can punch really hard on an objective, aren't a unit that can hold an objective. So what I basically mean by that is, yes, they can overwatch a unit and do a lot of damage, but if they're ever engaged in close combat, they're not going to be able to hold that objective for very long. And that's why they're kind of an awkward unit that requires a lot of finesse to use properly. As far as their keywords go, they do have the infantry and grenades keyword, and of course the grenades keyword is always helpful. It means that if you need to do a little bit of extra damage to a unit, you can do so fairly easily with mortal wounds. Alright, so what are the strengths and weaknesses of Dire Avengers? So their strengths are they do have solid range damage with lethal hits, that's nothing to scoff at. They do have also strong overwatch against infantry. Their overwatch against tougher targets, while it may seem good because of the lethal hits, ends up not really being that great, especially against, opponents who have a 2+ or even 3+ save. You probably will get a couple of wounds out of it, but in most cases, it's just not going to be worth the extra command points that you spent on Overwatch. Their weaknesses, of course, are that they are very fragile. They only have a 4+ armor save, so, when they are out in the open, covering an objective so you can get that 4+ Overwatch, they are going to be very exposed and will die fairly quickly. The strength of their Overwatch also, that goes along with that fragility, relies on them being on objectives. And again, when you're on objectives, you are a big target. Okay, so what are their combos and synergies? Well, Asurmen does give them +1 to hit and free Overwatch. Keep in mind that the +1 to hit does not apply to the Overwatch. It only applies to their shooting. So while they will have a 2+ to hit with shooting in their own shooting phase, they're still going to be hitting on 4+ in Overwatch. Which means if you are going to use Asurmen, it might also be worth it to bring Guide along with you, as it'll increase the shooting damage of this unit considerably. And in your own shooting phase, you can fish for lethal hits because you're going to be hitting on a 2+, so you might as well reroll it for those lethals. And when you're rolling to hit in Overwatch, you're going to be hitting much more reliably and doing a lot more damage. Doom also helps him wound a little bit easier. So if you have Eldrad in the army, never hurts to get a +1 modifier to your wound roll. So why did Dire Avengers take such a big hit post-Balanced Data Slate? So this is the big question, right? Why are all of a sudden Dire Avengers being shelved? Why are people saying that they're no good anymore? Well, essentially, Dire Avengers are strongest when fighting in the midboard on objectives to maximize their Overwatch. And technically speaking, if they're being used in other ways, they're just not being effective for the points, right? I mean, again, like we spoke of, for 5 more points, you can have Swooping Hawks, and Swooping Hawks are generally much better in a lot of different ways. They have comparable damage, and they're really good on scoring on objectives, and they have insane mobility. So really, if you want Dire Avengers to be strong for the points, you do need to invest in their ability to get the most out of them. And for this to work properly, Dire Avengers need a reliable way of ducking back behind terrain after they Overwatch. However, unfortunately, with the nerf to Phantasm, this is no longer possible. Now, this was once a favored tactic of mine and a lot of other Eldar players, right? We would use a Wave Serpent or just advance these guys up the board to a mid-objective early on in the game, and then basically give our opponents an ultimatum. Either you advance towards the objective, we Overwatch you, we deal some damage, and at the end of your movement phase, we just move back behind terrain, or you just don't go for that objective at all, and the Dire Avengers take the objective. And yeah, sure, you can try to outrange them with 24-inch guns and things like that, but if you try to play that game against the Dire Avengers and you don't kill every single last one of them, I'm going to be scoring those primary victory points, and eventually you're going to have to go after that objective. So this unit actually was a very powerful board control piece against the right opponents. Of course, some armies just didn't care about it. Vehicle-heavy armies could just kind of run into them, didn't really care about the Overwatch, stuff like that. But if your opponent was running infantry, they did have to deal with this unit in a very particular way. However, of course, with the nerf to Phantasm being D6 instead of 7 inches, the Dire Avengers aren't going to be reliably able to get back behind terrain, so a lot of times if an opponent is running infantry at you, they can call your bluff, they can force you to use the command points, and sometimes your Dire Avengers are just not going to be able to get out of the way. Sure, they're going to be able to Overwatch still, but it's not always going to be enough. And Dire Avengers are one of those weaker combat units to where, your regular assault intercessors or even, your jump pack assault intercessors will pretty much tear these guys apart in close combat in fairly quick order. But what, of course, about the Great Ass Man? And I know a lot of you guys are thinking about the Ass Man right now, but how does he kind of level up to the changes, right? Well, I personally think that while he is a powerful character in his own right, most of his value did lay in helping Dire Avengers control the midboard in the early game and support them in that role, right? He is a very devastating shooter. He has great shooting attacks, and he had pretty powerful combat. So if you were engaged by a fast-moving unit that was meant to tie up, your Dire Avengers in close combat, Asurmen could quickly dispatch them without too much trouble. But again, with the nerf to Phantasm, he really doesn't do anything to help the Dire Avengers survive against the ways that opponents can counter them. So unfortunately, post-Balanced Data Slate, I just think that the Ass Man has become a little bit out-assed. Okay, but we all still like Dire Avengers and we want them to work, right? We have Dire Avengers on our list. We don't want to just have to shelf them. So is there a better way to use Dire Avengers than what I just described? And I think, quite frankly, there is. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I think I have found a way to make them more effective. And of course, also harder to counter. So what is the best way to use Dire Avengers now? Well, I think the Dire Avengers are a good candidate for a turn 2 to turn 3 reserve unit. So a unit that you hold into reserve and, kind of wait until your opponent moves their models, you know where things are going, you've been able to destroy a few key targets. So when they do come in on the board, they have a little bit more room to operate efficiently. Also, with a rapid ingress, they can come in out of line of sight and provide overwatch against charging units. So this is situational, of course, but still very powerful. And of course, rapid ingress is a good idea also, because then during your next turn, you could advance them onto an objective and exert pressure on a flank. So you can use these guys to take out a key objective. Maybe your opponent was, guarding a little bit more lightly. Maybe a backfield objective or something like that. Swooping Hawks are good at this, but actually, believe it or not, 5 Swooping Hawks don't reliably kill even 10 guard equivalent models, like cultists and things like that. It's a little bit of a dice game as to whether they're going to kill them fully or not. And that means, of course, that those models are still going to hold the objective. But with a unit of Dire Avengers coming in behind via Rapid Ingress or Strategic Reserve on turn 3, you can definitely wipe out the full unit on the objective, and then of course, jump right onto the objective afterward. Through a combination of Phantasm and Fire and Fade. So I know that's 3 command points, but if it means getting, capture enemy outpost and also your opponent's home objective, 3 command points is a no-brainer to spend on that. And really, it's just up to whether or not you draw that secondary objective or not. But even so, capturing your opponent's home objective and then forcing your opponent to have to recapture it and deal with the Dire Avengers can be absolutely game-winning. But really, being in Strategic Reserve just gives them that level of tactical flexibility that they're really going to need to lean into, especially after the nerfs, because they're not really realistically going to be able to perform the same role in the same way as before. So the last thing I do want to address about Dire Avengers, though, that has been kind of on my mind here and there is whether or not it's viable to run them as a MSU unit. Basically a 5-man unit in a Falcon or just in Strategic Reserve in general to kind of run up the board, score secondaries, come out of reserve where needed, and things like that. And I really don't think this is a good idea still, because for Dire Avengers to be cost effective, they really do need to lean into their Overwatch ability. And if you're not leaning into this ability to hit harder on Overwatch, you're really missing the point of the unit. And at that point, there's just more effective units out there for the points, right? Again, Swooping Hawks are going to be able to do just as much damage as a minimum unit of Dire Avengers. Plus, they're also going to be able to score way better on secondary objectives. So if you're using Dire Avengers as a, kind of minimum unit action monkey, you're definitely not getting the full value out of the unit. So I definitely recommend that you still go with the 10-man unit of Dire Avengers, but perhaps use them in a slightly different role than before. So what role do Dire Avengers play in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of them? Well, Dire Avengers are still a ranged board control unit that needs to utilize its improved Overwatch effectively for success. However, the way in which they do that has changed considerably. You're no longer just going to have them, be put in a Wave Serpent or run up the board onto a mid objective and then challenge opponents to enter their Overwatch range. Because of the nerf to Phantasm, they are best placed in reserve, where they have the option of using Rapid Ingress or attacking the flank or even rear of your opponent's board edge to exert pressure in that way and then move them accordingly from there. And if they're used in that way, they can have a lot more success because they're going to be a lot harder to counter, right? Right now, there's a lot of things out there that can just bully Dire Avengers off an objective, and Dire Avengers don't have the tools anymore to be able to deal with that. Even with a Wave Serpent to help support them, a lot of the top armies out there just really aren't going to care about their Overwatch. Imperial Knights are back on the scene. They don't care one bit about the Overwatch of Dire Avengers. They will march right through it and then kill them and then laugh while doing it. The Necrons and the Dark Eldar can get really close to you, and yes, they will have to brave an Overwatch, but in the Dark Eldar's case, they're taking the Nightmare Shroud. They won't be able to be targeted by Overwatch, and they will rip your Dire Avengers up in close combat, something fierce. And of course, Necrons will probably take some casualties coming in if they're coming in with Immortals and stuff like that. But the problem with Immortals is that they do have that 24-inch range on their Tesla, which means your Dire Avengers aren't necessarily going to be able to get out of their range with Phantasm anymore. So really, there's just a lot of matchups now where that traditional tactic of running up with the Wave Serpent isn't going to work. In fact, it's going to get your Dire Avengers killed more often than not. So putting them in reserve where they can respond accordingly is going to be the better and more tactically flexible way to use them going forward. So in conclusion, Dire Avengers have taken one of the biggest hits due to the Phantasm nerf, but that doesn't mean they're out for the count. While they're definitely not as effective as a midboard control unit, if used wisely and tactically, they can still have a very big impact on the battlefield from reserve or by using the rapid ingress stratagem. And while I still don't think the Dire Avengers are going to be ultra competitive or anything like that, I do think they might still have a place in somebody's list if used well. Alright everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Let me know about what you think about Dire Avengers in the comments below, or if you found any interesting ways to use them in your lists post-balanced data slate and since the Phantasm nerfs. I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you so much once again also to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow considerably. If you do want to help support the channel and become a Patreon member, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to pick up some Eldar-inspired apparel on the channel store page, or you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave the links in the description for those also. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Peace out. See you guys next time and have some great games this week. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.